It was early morning when Rex, the experienced police dog, began his patrol through the cemetery. The air was cold, and the stillness of the graveyard gave off an eerie vibe. Rex had seen countless cases, but something felt off today. His fur stood on end as he walked between the tombstones, his senses heightened. Rex had been working with Officer Sarah Mitchell for years, and together they had solved many challenging cases. He wasn't just a dog, he was a partner, loyal and committed to his work. His instincts were sharp, and he had earned a reputation for tracking criminals and solving mysteries. But today was different. Rex wasn't with Sarah. It was a new officer, Emily Carter, who had requested to work with him. Emily was skilled, but she had never worked with a canine before and was unsure of what to expect. This would be their first investigation together. The cemetery had been the site of strange occurrences, people disappearing, only to return days later with no memory of their time gone. These disturbing reports had caught the attention of the police. Emily had heard of Rex's abilities, and she was eager to see him in action. Rex's keen senses led them to a particular grave, where he began digging furiously. Emily watched, uncertain but intrigued. Rex rarely acted this way unless something was amiss. He barked insistently, his eyes fixed on the grave. "Rex, what is it?" Emily asked, kneeling beside him. Rex's paws worked quickly, uncovering something beneath the soil. As the ground shifted, a subtle vibration ran through the earth, sending a chill down Emily's spine. She radioed for backup. "Officer Carter to dispatch. I need backup at the cemetery. Something's happening here." Rex, still alert, looked at Emily, as if to say, "There's more here than we realize." The mystery was just beginning. The discovery of the strange object in the cemetery unsettled Emily. As Rex unearthed a small, dark object from beneath the earth, its unusual, raw appearance immediately caught her attention. Rex's sharp instincts were on alert, his body stiff and eyes darting around, as if to warn her that something was off. Emily carefully inspected the object, which looked like a piece of meat, though it was unlike anything she had ever seen. Its surface was rough and irregular, dirt coating it in layers, suggesting it had been buried for some time. A foul, almost metallic, scent wafted up, heightening the eerie atmosphere surrounding the graveyard. Rex's growl confirmed her suspicions. It was something far more than a typical discovery. "Rex, what do you make of this?" Emily murmured under her breath, almost to herself, but the dog remained fixated on the object, refusing to look away. His stance made it clear that he was trying to make sense of something deeper, something more disturbing. Emily stood up and carefully radioed in for backup. "Dispatch. Officer Carter. I found something. It's a piece of meat. I need immediate backup at the cemetery. Please send a forensic team." The dispatcher's calm response did little to soothe her unease. "Copy that. Officer Carter. Backup is on the way. Stay alert." Rex seemed to be waiting, his focus unwavering. Emily scanned the cemetery, her mind racing. The discovery felt completely out of place. The piece of meat shouldn't have been buried here. The area, a quiet resting place for the dead, was not where such an object belonged. Her heart pounded as she noticed a crumpled piece of paper near the spot where the meat had been uncovered. With trembling hands, she retrieved and unfolded it. The note was hurriedly scribbled, the handwriting erratic. "You can't bury the past. It's always hungry." The cryptic message sent a chill through Emily. What did it mean? Why was it placed here, alongside the bizarre meat fragment? Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of backup. Detective Samuel Harris, a seasoned investigator, approached the scene. His sharp eyes immediately took in the situation: the unearthed fragment, the torn note, and Emily's nervous expression. "What have we got here, officer?" Detective Harris asked, kneeling beside her. Emily handed him the meat fragment, trying to steady her voice. "It's a piece of meat, but it's strange. Something's off. Rex found it buried here, and I found this note nearby." Harris inspected the fragment, his face serious. "This is definitely not normal. We'll need to get it analyzed. But it's strange to find something like this buried in a cemetery. Let's see what the lab makes of it." While the forensic team gathered the necessary samples and documented the scene, Emily couldn't shake the ominous feeling that had settled in her stomach. The note's message repeated in her mind: "You can't bury the past. It's always hungry." What was someone trying to say? And why go to such lengths to hide the meat in such a sacred place? The wind picked up, rustling the trees and making the tombstones cast eerie shadows. Emily looked down at Rex, who continued to sniff around the area where the fragment had been unearthed. His intense focus made it clear he was picking up on something that humans couldn't sense. His behavior, though familiar to Emily, seemed different today. His instincts were sharper than ever, as though warning of an impending danger. As the forensic team began packing up the meat fragment, Emily noticed a shift in the air. The cemetery, normally quiet and solemn, now felt tense, as though the discovery had disturbed something far deeper than the soil. Was it just her imagination, or did the place feel alive with the weight of secrets? Detective Harris stood up, glancing at the surroundings. "We're not done here. We need to trace where this came from. If someone's behind this, we need to know who and why." Emily nodded, but a feeling of dread washed over her. The discovery of the meat fragment, paired with the cryptic note, left more questions than answers. She was about to ask Harris his thoughts on the message when a call came through on her radio. "Officer Carter, we've got reports of another disturbance nearby. It might be connected." Without a second thought, Emily and Harris exchanged a look. This was only the beginning. The discovery in the cemetery had unveiled a mystery, one that went far deeper than a strange piece of meat and a torn note. What did it all mean? And what would the next few hours reveal about the dark secrets hiding within the town? As they left the cemetery, Emily felt her unease grow. It wasn't over yet. In fact, it had just begun. The past, as the note had said, was hungry, and it was clawing its way to the surface. As Emily and Detective Harris stood outside the cemetery, the chilling air around them seemed to thicken with each passing moment. The mysterious meat fragment and cryptic note had only deepened the enigma, leaving more unanswered questions than they could handle. But one thing was clear: this was no ordinary case. Their next step was to return to the scene where Rex had found the meat fragment. The unsettling feeling in Emily's gut hadn't left her since the discovery. She couldn't help but wonder if the clues were leading them to something much darker and far more dangerous than anyone could have anticipated. With the forensic team working in the background to analyze the fragment, Emily and Harris turned their attention to another lead that had recently surfaced: the cemetery's oldest and most mysterious grave. A coffin that had been recently disturbed. The disturbed grave stood out among the others. Its location, deep in the heart of the cemetery, had long been a topic of curiosity and speculation among the locals. The grave belonged to a man named Richard Caldwell, a name that held weight in the town's dark history. Caldwell was rumored to have been involved in strange rituals and occult practices before his death many years ago. Some believed that his grave had been cursed, while others insisted that the coffin contained something far more sinister than a simple corpse. Harris looked down at the disturbed earth, his brow furrowed. This is where it all began. Let's see what we're dealing with. They approached the coffin slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The coffin itself had been unearthed partially, its dark wood exposed to the elements. It was clear that someone, or something, had been trying to break into it. Emily's heart raced as they examined the cryptic symbols etched into the wood. They were foreign to her, but they struck her as familiar. They were the same markings as those found on the torn note earlier. "You can't bury the past. It's always hungry." Rex growled lowly beside her, his ears pressed back, alert and tense. Emily reached down and carefully traced the symbols with her fingers, trying to make sense of them. The markings seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as if they were waiting for something. Emily quickly stepped back, a sense of dread crawling up her spine. Detective Harris pulled out a small notebook from his jacket pocket. He quickly began scribbling down notes. "I've seen these symbols before. They're linked to occult practices. Whoever was digging up this grave didn't just want to steal something. They were after something far more dangerous." Emily's mind raced as she tried to piece together the puzzle. But why here? And what does it have to do with the meat fragment? Before Harris could answer, Emily's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and saw that it was a message from the forensic team. The encrypted data they had recovered from the note had finally been decoded. She quickly read through the message, her pulse quickening as she absorbed the information. The encrypted data revealed a set of coordinates, along with a date and time. It was clear now that someone was attempting to hide something, a secret buried deep within the town's history. But what was it? And why was it being guarded so fiercely? Harris, noticing her tension, stepped closer. What does it say? Emily handed him her phone, her voice tight. It's a set of coordinates and a time. This could be our next lead. Without hesitation, they gathered their things and prepared to follow the trail. The coordinates led them to a location on the outskirts of town, an old, abandoned building that had once been a church. The church had been condemned years ago, but rumors had long circulated about strange happenings within its crumbling walls. As Emily and Harris approached the building, Rex suddenly stopped, his body rigid with alertness. He was staring intently at the church doors, his growl barely audible. Emily followed his gaze, her stomach twisting. It was as if the building itself was watching them, waiting. They pushed open the creaking doors, the darkness within seeming to swallow them whole. The air was thick with dust, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed in the silence. As they made their way deeper into the church, Emily's flashlight caught something on the altar, a small, intricately carved box. With a sense of inevitability, Emily walked toward it, her hands trembling. Inside the box lay a journal, its pages yellowed with age. As she flipped through the pages, she realized that this was no ordinary book. The entries were written in a code, one that mirrored the encrypted data they had just decoded. The journal's contents were a chilling record of ritualistic practices, occult symbols, and cryptic instructions, many of which referred to Richard Caldwell's grave. The final entry stood out. The past will not remain buried. The hunger grows. Emily felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The coffin, the meat fragment, and the encrypted data were all connected. But the true horror was yet to be revealed. As Emily and Detective Harris stood in the dimly lit church, the weight of the journal's revelation pressed heavily on them. The connection between Richard Caldwell's grave, the occult rituals, and the disturbing findings left them with more questions than answers. The final entry of the journal, with its ominous declaration that the past will not remain buried, echoed in Emily's mind. The hunt for the truth was only getting darker. The investigation now led them down a winding path, tangled in mysteries that seemed impossible to unravel. But there was one thing Emily couldn't shake: the name Edward Sanders. Edward Sanders was a name that had surfaced in the town's history before, but it had always been linked to rumors and whispers. An eccentric scholar with a penchant for the occult, Sanders had lived in the town decades ago before disappearing without a trace. Some said he had delved too deeply into forbidden knowledge, and his disappearance was a result of his dangerous pursuits. Others believed that his fate was tied to the very rituals Richard Caldwell had been rumored to practice. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but with each new revelation, the sense of dread grew stronger. Sanders had been studying Caldwell and the occult practices in the area long before Emily and Harris had begun their investigation. His research was said to have been documented in a series of private notes and journals, many of which had gone missing after his sudden disappearance. It was clear that the connection between the two men was more than just coincidence. Harris, who had been closely following Emily's train of thought, spoke up, his voice tight. Edward Sanders. He was obsessed with the rituals surrounding Caldwell's death. His work is rumored to be locked away, hidden from public view. But if he was studying these rituals, he might know something about what's happening now. Emily's heart skipped a beat. If Sanders was involved with Caldwell, then he might hold the key to understanding what's happening with the grave, the meat fragment, and the strange events surrounding them. They quickly returned to their investigation, determined to find any trace of Sanders' work that might shed light on the current mystery. Their search led them to Sanders' former residence, a decaying mansion on the outskirts of town. The house had been abandoned for years, its windows boarded up and its once grand facade now crumbling with neglect. It was a place that had long since fallen into obscurity, much like the man who had lived there. As they entered the mansion, the air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under their weight. The faint scent of decay lingered in the air, making it clear that no one had set foot in this house for quite some time. Emily's flashlight flickered as they moved deeper into the building, the beam illuminating old furniture covered in white sheets. It was as though time had stopped in this house, leaving everything frozen in a moment of eerie stillness. They searched the house methodically, moving from room to room in search of anything that could offer more clues. It was in the study, however, that they found what they were looking for: an old, worn book resting on a desk. Its pages were yellowed with age, but the text inside was still legible. Emily's fingers trembled as she opened it, the title on the cover catching her attention: The Forbidden Rituals of Richard Caldwell. Flipping through the pages, Emily realized that Sanders had documented everything: Caldwell's rituals, the symbols, the strange practices, and even references to a hidden power that could never be fully controlled. The last entry in the book was chilling. The hunger will rise again. It is inevitable. It must be fed. Her eyes widened as the implications sank in. The hunger was not just a metaphor. It was something far more tangible, something that had been waiting in the shadows, ready to break free. It seemed that Sanders had uncovered something far darker than anyone could have imagined. Harris, who had been scanning the room for additional clues, turned toward Emily with a look of realization. The meat fragment, the symbols, the hunger, it's all connected. This isn't just about Caldwell anymore. It's about something far older, far more dangerous. Emily nodded grimly. It's coming, and if we don't stop it, everything will change. As the tension in the room mounted, Emily knew that their investigation had just uncovered the tip of an iceberg. The connection to Edward Sanders was just the beginning, and what lay ahead could very well be the end of everything they knew. The cryptic clues from Edward Sanders' journal had led Emily and Detective Harris to a disturbing new discovery. As they stood in the cemetery, surrounded by the stillness of the graves, the weight of the situation pressed heavily upon them. The search for answers had taken them far beyond what they had initially anticipated, and now they were on the verge of uncovering something that seemed almost too impossible to believe. The grave of Richard Caldwell was more than just a burial site. It was a gateway to something hidden deep beneath the earth. As Emily pored over Sanders' notes, one passage stood out, a reference to an underground network that ran beneath the cemetery. The description was vague, but it hinted at an ancient structure, long forgotten by time, that had been used for ritualistic purposes. Sanders had believed that this underground passage was the key to understanding the strange events surrounding Caldwell's death. Driven by the need to uncover the truth, Emily and Harris decided to investigate further. They made their way to the cemetery under the cover of night, when the graveyard was shrouded in an eerie silence. The moonlight cast long shadows across the weathered tombstones, and the wind whispered through the trees, creating an atmosphere of tension and anticipation. With the journal in hand, they retraced Sanders' steps, following the clues he had left behind. Emily's heart raced as they approached the area near Caldwell's grave. It was here, Sanders had written, that the entrance to the underground network could be found. But where? The cemetery had been thoroughly searched in the past, and no one had ever reported finding anything unusual beneath the ground. As they examined the grave, Emily noticed something that had eluded them before: a slight disturbance in the earth, a barely noticeable indentation near the base of the gravestone. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but to Emily, it was the final clue they needed. Harris knelt down beside her, pulling out a small shovel from his bag. They worked in silence, digging carefully around the area, each scoop of dirt bringing them closer to the truth. Minutes later, the shovel struck something hard. Harris paused, glancing at Emily with a mix of surprise and disbelief. They cleared away the remaining dirt to reveal a heavy stone slab, worn with age, but clearly not a natural part of the grave. It was a hidden door, its edges sealed tight, as though it had been purposely concealed for centuries. Emily's hands trembled as she examined the slab. The markings on it matched those from Sanders' journal, symbols of an ancient cult that had long since disappeared from history. This was no ordinary cemetery. It was a place where forbidden rituals had taken place, and the underground network was far more than just a myth. With a grunt, Harris pushed against the stone, and after a moment of resistance, it shifted, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. The air that escaped from below was cool and musty, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and decay. Emily hesitated, but Harris, ever the determined detective, was already stepping onto the stairs. "Ready?" he asked, glancing back at her. Emily nodded, her mind racing with questions. What would they find beneath the cemetery? And what had Caldwell and Sanders uncovered in their pursuit of dark knowledge? Together, they descended into the darkness, their footsteps echoing through the stone corridors. The passage was narrow and winding, the walls lined with ancient carvings that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. Every turn they took only deepened the sense of unease that was growing within them. As they moved deeper into the underground network, the temperature dropped, and the air grew thicker with a strange, almost palpable presence. It was as though they were being watched, as though the very walls of the tunnel held secrets that had been buried for far too long. Emily could feel the weight of history pressing in on her, and the closer they got to the heart of the underground network, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Finally, they reached a large chamber, its walls covered in strange symbols and intricate murals that depicted scenes of ritualistic ceremonies. At the center of the room stood a stone altar, its surface stained with something dark and ominous. The air in the chamber was heavy, and the feeling of being in a sacred and forbidden place was undeniable. It was here that Emily and Harris would uncover the full extent of the ancient cult's influence. The underground network was not just a hiding place. It was the epicenter of a dark power that had been lurking beneath the surface for centuries, waiting for the right moment to rise again. The discovery beneath the cemetery was just the beginning, and as Emily gazed around the chamber, she realized that the truth they had been seeking was far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The discovery of the underground network beneath the cemetery had set in motion a series of events that no one could have anticipated. As Emily and Detective Harris delved deeper into the mysteries surrounding the ancient cult and its dark rituals, the tension in the air grew palpable. Every step they took, every clue they uncovered, seemed to lead them closer to an inevitable confrontation. But it wasn't just the hidden network or the ancient symbols that threatened them now. It was the looming presence of an enemy who had been watching their every move. In the days following their descent into the underground network, Emily and Harris found themselves facing an escalating sense of danger. The more they uncovered about the cult's dark practices, the clearer it became that their discoveries were not only disturbing but also highly sought after. The enemies, unseen but ever present, had been planning their move for some time. And now, it seemed, they were finally ready to strike. Emily's phone buzzed late one evening with a text from Harris. The message was brief but urgent. "They know. They're coming for us." Her heart raced as she read the words. The message confirmed her suspicions. The enemies who had been operating in the shadows were no longer content to let them uncover the secrets buried beneath the cemetery. It wasn't just about knowledge anymore. It was about control. The ancient cult, or perhaps a shadow organization connected to it, was determined to prevent the truth from coming to light at any cost. The attack plan had been set into motion. Emily and Harris weren't just up against the dark forces of the past. They were now facing a highly organized, ruthless enemy who would stop at nothing to silence them. The warning signs had been there all along. But now, it was clear that their enemies were executing their final play. Emily felt a rush of adrenaline as she tried to make sense of the situation. They had no time to waste. The enemy's reach was vast, and their resources seemingly endless. Harris had already suggested that they go into hiding, but Emily knew that running wasn't an option. They were too close to the truth. Too much was at stake. The tension in the air was thick, and every passing hour seemed to bring them closer to the enemy's strike. Emily's mind raced as she thought of the many possible ways the enemy might move. Who could they trust? How could they prepare for an attack that could come from any direction? In an effort to stay one step ahead, Harris began to mobilize their resources. He contacted allies, set up surveillance around their apartment, and fortified their communications, ensuring that every step they took would be monitored for any signs of the enemy's movements. But even with these precautions, the sense of impending danger was undeniable. The enemy was methodical. precise, and most of all, patient. They had likely been planning this attack for months, if not years. Every moment now felt like a countdown to when their adversaries would make their move. As they strategized, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, the very shadows around them thickening with a malevolent presence. She knew that the enemy wasn't just after the information they had uncovered, they were after their lives. The power that the underground network represented was too great, too dangerous for anyone to control. The enemies knew that Emily and Harris had the key to unlocking its secrets, and they would stop at nothing to prevent them from doing so. With time running out, Emily and Harris made the decision to take the fight to the enemy. They couldn't wait for the inevitable attack to come. They had to be proactive. Every move, every decision from here on out had to be made with precision. They couldn't afford mistakes. The night was growing darker as they prepared to execute their countermeasures. Emily's fingers trembled as she checked her weapons and made final preparations. Harris, ever the calm presence, began to go over the plan once more. They would use the enemy's own tactics against them, turning the tables and hoping to gain the upper hand. But as the hours ticked down, the weight of the situation settled heavily upon them. The knowledge they had uncovered could bring about a new world order, or destroy everything they had ever known. Emily knew they were walking a razor-thin line, one where the stakes couldn't be higher. But the enemy was also aware of this. They were coming for them, and every second that passed made their movements more inevitable. As the plan began to unfold, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The attack was no longer a distant threat. It was happening now, and there was no turning back. The night had fallen silent, but Emily and Harris could feel the tension building in the air. Their every movement was calculated as they ventured deeper into the heart of the enemy's territory. After weeks of gathering intel, piecing together cryptic clues, and facing numerous close calls, they were finally closing in on the truth. But the closer they got to unraveling the mystery, the more dangerous it became. Their journey had led them to an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city, a place that, on the surface, appeared to be just another decrepit structure. However, Emily's instincts told her that something far more sinister was hidden within its walls. As they crept through the darkened halls, their hearts raced with the knowledge that they were walking straight into the heart of the enemy's operations. The thought of confrontation lingered heavily in the air, an inevitable clash with the very forces they had been hunting for months. As they rounded a corner, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, and their breath caught in their throats. A shadow moved just beyond the flickering light, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow down. Then, without warning, the door at the end of the hall creaked open, and they were face to face with the leader of the cult, the mastermind behind the series of events that had haunted them since the first clue was discovered. The confrontation was intense, both sides aware of the stakes at hand. Words were exchanged, filled with accusations and desperate attempts to sway each other's position. Emily's mind raced as she pieced together everything she had learned. The leader's cold, calculating demeanor spoke volumes about the control they had over the entire operation. This was not just a group of fanatics. It was an organization with reach and influence beyond anything Emily and Harris had imagined. But as the tension between them grew, something unexpected happened. In the midst of their heated exchange, Emily noticed a faint glow emanating from a small door hidden behind a stack of crates. Her curiosity piqued. She motioned to Harris, signaling that something important lay behind that door. The leader, sensing the shift in their focus, immediately attempted to block them from advancing. But Emily was quicker, and with a sudden burst of movement, she pushed past the leader and forced the door open. Inside, they discovered a room filled with advanced technology, screens, buttons, and wires leading to a central control panel. The realization hit them like a ton of bricks. This was not just an underground cult. It was part of a much larger operation, one that spanned multiple locations and operated with the precision of a well-oiled machine. The discovery of this hidden control room changed everything. On the screens before them, Emily and Harris could see live footage from various surveillance cameras, footage from their own apartment, from the cemetery, and even from their recent travels. The enemy had been watching their every move, keeping tabs on them at every step. But it wasn't just surveillance. The control system was designed to manipulate events, orchestrating attacks and ensuring that their enemies were always a step ahead. The implications of what they had discovered were staggering. The cult wasn't just a group of zealots trying to resurrect an ancient order. They were being guided, controlled, and monitored by a far more powerful force. Someone, somewhere, had been using this hidden system to pull the strings from the shadows. As they processed the enormity of their discovery, the air in the room grew colder, and the realization set in. They were no longer just fighting against the cult. They were up against a network of global proportions, with tendrils reaching into every facet of society. Emily's mind raced as she realized that they were now in possession of information that could topple this hidden empire. But with that knowledge came an even greater danger. If the enemy learned of their discovery, the consequences would be dire. In that moment, Emily and Harris understood the full scale of the battle they were now embroiled in. This was no longer just a quest for answers, it was a fight for survival. And with the secret control system in their hands, they had the power to fight back. But only if they could outmaneuver the enemies who were closing in on them. As the door slammed shut behind them, they knew that they had just scratched the surface of something far more sinister than they could have ever imagined. The stakes had been raised, and the road ahead was fraught with peril. But one thing was certain, they would not back down. The tension had reached its peak. Emily and Harris stood at the precipice of an unimaginable battle, the secret control system now in their hands. The hidden network was vast, but so too were the forces arrayed against them. Their enemies, aware that their plans were at risk, were closing in from all sides. They had no choice but to face the source of the danger head-on. The night before the final confrontation, the weight of everything they had uncovered pressed heavily on Emily's mind. Every piece of the puzzle had led them here, to the heart of the enemy's operation, where the leader awaited. Their goal was clear: stop the cult's plan from coming to fruition and destroy the hidden network controlling it all. But in their hearts, they knew that what lay ahead would test their resolve like never before. They arrived at the enemy's stronghold just before dawn. The sky still a bruised purple. The once silent streets now hummed with the unspoken knowledge that something monumental was about to unfold. Emily and Harris moved in stealth, their hearts pounding in rhythm with their footsteps. The door to the central control room lay ahead, and with it, the final confrontation. The leader awaited them, standing before a massive array of screens, each displaying images of chaos and unrest. The cult had been executing their plan with terrifying precision, and now it was time for the final phase. But Emily and Harris were not the same individuals who had first entered this fight. They had grown, adapted, and learned, both from each other and the enemy. They knew that to win, they needed more than just the element of surprise. They needed to outthink the mastermind who had orchestrated it all. As they entered the room, the leader greeted them with a cold smile. "Did you really think you could stop this?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're too late. The plan is already in motion." But Emily's determination was unwavering. "Not if we can help it," she replied, stepping forward. The final battle was upon them, and every second counted. The leader initiated the countdown for the final phase of the plan, his fingers dancing over the control panel. But just as he was about to press the final button, Emily launched herself forward, using the element of surprise to knock him off balance. Harris quickly followed, wrestling with the guards who had emerged from the shadows to protect their leader. The room erupted into chaos, the flickering screens casting eerie shadows on the walls. In the heat of the moment, Emily realized that the leader's true power lay not in the control system but in his ability to manipulate those around him. The true nature of the network was not just to execute a plan. It was to create fear and uncertainty, to make people question what they knew and trust no one. The leader had preyed on humanity's weaknesses, twisting them into tools of destruction. With one swift move, Emily disabled the control system. The countdown ceased, the screens flickering out one by one. The cult's plan, so carefully orchestrated, crumbled before them. The leader, now stripped of his power, collapsed in defeat. Emily and Harris stood over him, breathing heavily but victorious. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. As the sun began to rise, Emily and Harris walked out of the stronghold, the weight of their victory slowly sinking in. The enemy had been defeated, but they knew that there would always be more battles to fight. They had exposed the network and its hidden power. But the world was a vast and uncertain place. New threats would emerge, and they would have to face them as they always had, together. The final confrontation had tested their limits, pushed them to the brink of exhaustion, and forced them to confront their own fears. But in the end, their resilience had won the day. The secret control system was destroyed, and the world was safe, for now. The journey had been long and filled with peril, but Emily and Harris knew that the real fight was just beginning.